welcome back to Full Recovery. A few days ago, my husband, in a radio broadcast from our church, gave a list of things that he had enacted in his life and in our family's life that really spoke to me, and I thought maybe might be a help to those of you today who are in the throes of child rearing, or maybe you're newly married and don't have children yet, or you have grandchildren on the way, and maybe this would be a help to your future grandbabies that come. But I thought it was very interesting and very moving, some of the things that all of the things that my husband mentioned. But when I think of fatherhood, Proverbs 17:6 comes to mind, and it says, "Children's children are the crown of old men, and the glory of children are their fathers." Sometimes as mothers, we get the idea that because these children come along, they're newborns, we do all the caring for them, or most of it, and we do a pretty good job at loving and nurturing. We sometimes put undue pressure on the fathers in their lives. Sometimes we even deny them a chance to become the great fathers that they could be for a myriad of reasons. But my husband and I both firmly believe that strong fatherhood is greatly enhanced by supportive motherhood. And so today, I hope as we walk through some of these things that my husband had listed in his radio broadcast, that it will be a help to us as women as we encourage those who are the fathers in our lives. And there's not a greater dad on the planet than this man. And I had the privilege when I was in college to observe how he was with children and how he interacted with children. And I knew he was going to be a great dad. I didn't know how great, but he's just been an amazing father to our 3 children, and now he's an amazing father-in-law, and about to be an amazing grandfather. And so today I just wanted to talk with him about some of those things that he mentioned. On the broadcast on Sunday, you mentioned 8 foundational principles that have guided you in fatherhood. And so I'd just like for you to talk about those for a few minutes.
All right. Before I do, I want to say this. I'm afraid that far too many parents are hesitant to give child rearing pointers for a lot of reasons. Number one, they don't want to make it sound like they're experts. Number two, they don't want to imply that their children are great, or that their children are finished products. Nobody's children are finished products. And number three, they've read child rearing books that don't line up with the lives of the author's children. In other words, the author's children are disappointment, and they look back at the book and say, now what good is this book? And those are all valid things, but I think we're cheating the next generation if we don't give them some pointers, some wisdom. And so I'm not a great father. We're not exemplary parents, but by the grace of God, we've seen him do some things, and he's used some principles, and so I think it's helpful to pass those along. And the truth is, I could list 20 couples off the top of my head, Christian couples, older, wiser than I, that I would love to hear their input on these things. And I hope maybe this encourages some other Christian parents to do this, to put out there, hey, this is what worked for us, and praise the Lord that he blessed us. But I want to give you some foundational things that helped me. First of all, as you know, when I was young in my teens, my Christian school principal, who was, I guess, 15 years older than me, maybe, he encouraged all of us as students to put wisdom at the top of our prayer list. And I don't know why this is not considered the number one child rearing advice.
Right.
Because everything else depends on this, that you pray for wisdom every day. And after we were married and we were looking towards having children, and as you know, once we found out that you were going to have a a baby, we began to pray, both of us, God, give us wisdom. We're doing something that we've never done before, and we can read all the books in the world, but we need to know how to react, how to respond. We need to get it right the first time. We don't want to leave our children lacking and so forth. So we prayed for wisdom. God-given wisdom helps you tackle new territory. And parenting is new territory. There's nobody, when you have that first child, who has done it before, who has any experience. And nothing else that you might have done. You say, well, man, I was a babysitter for 12 years. Well, good for you, but that does not prepare you for parenting. And so God-given wisdom prepares you in any facet of life to tackle the unknown. And parenting is a great unknown. And so praying for wisdom every single day, put it at the top of your prayer list and earnestly pray for it. God, I've got to have it. Without your wisdom, I will fail. I will blow this. So pray for wisdom. I think it's God answering that prayer that helped me formulate some of, and by the way, I'm going to say me and I a lot, I'm sure, but this is a we thing. We did this, our effort has been together. And so, forgive me if I say I too much, but it's we. But I think it's that wisdom that caused us to formulate these other ideas. Most of these first principles were before our children were born. Other of the first principles we formulated as they were babies, as they were young. And so anyhow, but I think they're all based in the God-given wisdom. And that God-given wisdom helped me to understand, first of all, that I want my children to be better than me. I want them to be stronger than me. I want them to be smarter than me. I want them to be wiser than me. And so because the natural tendency in life, if we do nothing, if we make no effort, is for the second generation to be weaker than the first. And that will automatically happen. That your children will go after the Lord less fervently than you do if you make no effort otherwise. That they will have less discipline, less. Now there's exceptions to that, but the natural tendency, the thing that most often happens if we do nothing, is that they will be weaker than we are. Proverbs says that the horse leech hath two daughters, crying, give, give. In other words, I take that as meaning the second generation will take your weaknesses and double them. And if we do nothing, it'll get worse. And so if we want to change that, we have to make the effort on purpose to make them better than we are, stronger than we are. And we can't be too proud. Hey, you can't be too proud that when you succeed, that now all of a sudden you start making excuses to keep them down, lest they make you look bad. Nothing makes you look worse than to be too proud to make your children better than you. Nothing makes you look better as a parent. Not that we're concerned how we look, except that's what holds us back sometimes, is our concern for how you look. So understand that nothing makes you look better than to humble yourself and say, okay, I had these weaknesses. How can I equip my children to bypass that stage of their life that I went through? And so that was one of my foundational things, praying for wisdom, building my children to be stronger than me, and then understanding that the word train is 24/7, 365 for 18 plus years. You don't get time off from training your children. And so let me put that in plainer terms, that you can't live a half-hearted life and raise wholehearted children.
Right.
You can't live a neglectful life and raise responsible children. Now, none of us is perfect, and we all have plenty of weaknesses, and we all wish we had more character and self-discipline than we have. But we can't take time off from making the effort, because one of the most important elements of train is me being what I'm supposed to be. And so I've got to understand, if I'm going to train up my children the way they should go, I've got to live the way they should go. And I can't make excuses for myself. I can't give myself time off in that regard. It's not that you can't ever take a break. I'm saying training happens even in your timeouts. You take a vacation, fine, but if you teach your children that you take a break from them to watch R-rated movies, first of all, they're going to figure that out.
Yeah.
And secondly, it's going to become a part of their mentality that I can take a break from reality and go where I'm otherwise not supposed to go. So train up is a full-time thing. And then here's another principle that just really I found to be very powerful, that my children will be, well, let's put R in here. We knew this. Our children will be what we make them. Mm-hmm. That is so important for us to understand. You know, sometimes you hear people say about their kids, well, I was just blessed with a good one. Or the opposite. You know what? I just got stuck with a really bad kid. There are no accidental good ones, and there are no inherently bad ones. Right. They are what we make them. They are what we make them. And so that really impacted my thinking of being a good father. And then this, and I didn't sit down to write a list of things that I thought would sound good. These are things that actually shaped my parenting. And so somehow I realized before our daughter was born, for anyone who doesn't know who's watching, we have 3 children. They're all adults now. Our oldest is my daughter Catherine, and she's married and about to have a child of her own. And middle child is my son Joe. He is married. And then my daughter Amanda is going into her senior year of college. And so they're all adults. And before my oldest was born, by the grace of God, He gave me the wisdom to understand that no matter what I train her to do, no matter what rules I put in place, no matter how strictly I enforce them, the day will come that she is going to choose. Now, first of all, I had to decide, and I did decide, that no matter what she chooses, I'm her father, she's my daughter, I love her no matter what. I tried to think before she was born and when all 3 of our kids were small, what's the worst case scenario? What's the worst thing that they could choose? And I tried to identify some of those things, and then I decided if he or she chose some of those worst case scenario things, how am I going to treat them? And the answer is I'm going to love them. I decided before they were born that there's not going to be any such thing as I disown you. You are no longer my child. I don't understand that. I absolutely don't understand that. And I decided that's just not going to be part of my life. Their choices are their choices, and I love them no matter what, and genuinely love them no matter what. And I decided that we're never going to have a child who, by my doing, is going to feel uncomfortable coming over for a visit or coming to Thanksgiving dinner, coming to Christmas, no matter what they ever choose. And that's liberating to choose that. I think a lot of our parenting we do in fear, and we do in fear of what other people are going to think. Yeah. What if my child chooses this or embraces this or goes that direction? And we're so scared of what other people's estimation of our parenting is going to be that we try to keep our kids in a box. And once you decide, you know what, no, my first responsibility is not to other people's opinion. My first responsibility in life, in the sight of God, is to my wife and my children. So whatever they choose, I'm going to love them no matter what, no matter what everybody else thinks. But it also shaped how we tried to raise our children. In other words, I can put my kids in a very tight box and try to keep them there, but they're going to spring like a jack in the box. They're going to spring And 15, 20 years from now, they are going to spring. And so I can do that, or I can teach them to make right choices. I can let them make some of their own mistakes. And I'll talk about that probably in a little bit, but it was very important for me to understand from the get-go that no matter what I do, my kids are going to grow up, and 15 to 20 years from now, they are going to choose their way for themselves. And anyhow, then one of the great realizations that we made is that we are 100% in control when they're small, when they're newborn, and the first 2, 3, 4, 5 years. The older they get, the less this is true. But when they're small, we are 100% in control of what influences them. If I don't want them to say certain words, I make sure they don't hear certain words. If I don't want them to hear a certain kind of music, if I don't want them to like a certain kind of music, I make sure they don't hear a certain kind of music. And we went to family weddings when they were small, and at the reception they'd be blaring the music and dancing. I remember one wedding, and if you're listening, I don't mean to hurt you in any way, but literally the ceremony was 2.5 hours long. I'm not exaggerating, because it was so religiously strong, and I'm saying religiously, religiously strong. But the reception was the exact opposite. The bottles came out and the dance floor opened up. And so during the reception, if I remember correctly, Catherine was about 2 years old. And every time the music got overbearing, one of us would take Catherine outside, because we didn't want her to, not only to not hear that kind of music, but we didn't want her seeing us in the middle of that kind of music, and in her mind assessing that and going, okay, my parents are okay in this environment. And so we would take her out. Now, you may think that's over the top, but we fully understood. Even when my wife was expecting our children, my wife read something, and I don't know the terminology, maybe you can explain that, where the first time they hear something, it connects something. What was the word?
It joins their nerve endings together.
Nerve endings together.
So they make a connection, and until they are 3 years old, those initial connections continue to happen. So whatever they encounter for the first time is a nerve ending connection, and it's a permanent part of their makeup.
So it formulates who they are.
Yes.
So we wanted to make sure that they're not. We didn't curse anyway. But let's face it, there's all words that we all use that are borderline. Now, just to give you an example, and you're not going to like this, but I want you to have an example, is the word crap, okay? I'm sorry that's now on
we
your
need to edit that out.
On your podcast or on your YouTube. But that's a word, let's face it, that we all use.
Not me.
I know, and I know there's some Pharisees out there saying, not me, I don't ever say that, but your husband does, okay? So, but that's a good example of a word that we don't put that in our curse word category. That's not, most of us don't say that. That's a horrible word. We don't say it. But we didn't want that to be a part of our children's preliminary vocabulary. Now, frankly, they probably all three use it now. Pretty sure they do.
No, they don't.
Okay. But we didn't want that to be a part of their core vocabulary. So
if you do, don't tell me.
We removed it. I removed it at the get-go. We made sure, and we didn't have cable at that time, cable TV or anything. So basically, our TV watching was very limited. But we never saw anything that used any language, and my wife would remind me of that nerve ending thing by going bzzz, and even raising my voice and so forth. We were totally conscious of how we were influencing them.
Yes. And
that was a huge factor. Now, the older they get, the less control you have over what influences man. But when they're newborn and 1 and 2 and 3 years old, you're totally in control. And that's what, look, I'm not condemning what anybody does. I'm telling you what we did. We didn't do any kind of daycare. We didn't do any kind of really secular anything. Babysitters, you know, we would never have a stranger as a babysitter. Never did. Because that was letting go of some influence. My wife's sister stayed with us some at that time. She was an excellent influence. So she did, when we needed a babysitter, she was the babysitter. We had control over
or your parents did
my
a lot
parents,
too.
yep. Or my wife's mom would come for a visit. Those are all excellent influences. But to you know, ask your neighbor, hey, who do you have babysit for you? And you have no idea what your child, what your 1-year-old, what your 6-month-old is going to hear. And you say, well, it's just a couple hours. How can they damage them? And I think it's one of the big mistakes we make is we underestimate the influence. Okay, I look at kids, and of course, having made thousands of home visits over the years and new doors and making bus ministry visits, you go into homes and you see an 18-month-old in a room filled with smoke, with music, ba-boom, 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 people screaming at each other, open bottles everywhere. Okay, those things are extreme, but we all know they happen. But let's also understand that if you're arguing in front of your infant, they're digesting that.
Yep.
That becomes part of their makeup. We didn't want turmoil to be part of their makeup. I probably went a little off too much on that one, but it's so important. I realize that I've got to win my children's hearts. If you don't win their heart, then your training can be all in vain. In other words, if you teach them every good thing in that they need to be taught, but they don't like you, it's very possible they'll choose the opposite path just to spite you. And so I've got to win their hearts. Now, you know, you've got to find a balance, because I don't believe in just being buddy-buddy with your children so that you tolerate everything you shouldn't tolerate. But there's a difference between that and winning their heart. Even when you have to make hard decisions and say hard no's sometimes, if you do it with the right spirit, you can still keep their heart. And so I realized I needed to win their heart. This is a silly illustration maybe, but it helps you maybe see when you ask someone why they're a fan of a certain team. I'll use one of my least favorite teams as an example of this. Ask a Mets fan why they're a Mets fan. And so many times, I'm telling you, so many times I've heard Mets fans say, well, my father liked the Yankees and I couldn't stand my father, so I decided to become a Mets. That's a silly illustration, but it's an accurate one. That a child is so angry at his parents or her parents that they choose the opposite of what they know their parents have embraced. So I knew I had to win their hearts. And the last thing,
well, I just want to say on that point really quickly that I think, and this, you know, maybe this is kind of a silly way to say this, but I think that as a dad, if you have a superpower, it is the ability to have our kids' hearts. I don't think that I have been as successful at that as you have been as their father. I think I have been far too analytical and micromanaging, and I think that your role as father has been so bolstering to their spirits and who they are as people, that even now they're all grown, they're adults, and for you to say, I'm so proud of you, means so. I'm not saying that it doesn't mean anything when I say it, but it means so much coming from you, because you do have their hearts and you have worked on that. If you know my husband's testimony, then I won't go into that whole thing now, but when our oldest daughter was born on May 12th, 1995, that was the first time that my husband looked into the face of a blood relative and saw someone who had the features that he has, and our daughter, all three of our kids look just like him, but
Poor kids.
The girls have some of me now, but when she was born, he just held her for a very long time. It was going on a couple of hours before he would let anybody else get their hands on her. And they've always had a very strong bond, but he's had the same strong bond with all three of our children. And he has worked very hard to win their hearts. That's been crucial in rearing them. I would say, as their mother, looking at who they are as adults, that might be the defining, or at least one of the defining characteristics of who they are as people, is the fact that their dad worked so hard to win their hearts genuinely. And I think you've done a great job of that. All right, you can go on to the next one.
Well, the last one of the foundational principles is, and this of all these came later than the others, but I realized that my other great prayer need was to beg God for mercy.
Yes.
And because none of us can be a perfect parent. And I've heard parents say, and we've all heard parents say, maybe you said this and it's fine, but they look at their children, they look at their parenting, and they make this statement: I did everything right. I did everything I was supposed to do, and still this happened. And here's the thing: we don't all do everything right. Not a one of us. We don't all do everything we're supposed to do, because we're human. We're weak. You may have seen, I don't know, they run them here. I don't know if they run them around the country, but they run these ads that say you don't have to be perfect to be a parent, and yada yada. And that's true. I mean, the reason they run the ads is because it's true. You don't have to be perfect. But more important than that, you can't be perfect. We are flawed people trying to raise perfect children. So I have to ask God for mercy. In other words, Lord, this is my effort. This is what I've tried to do. Now please have mercy. Please have mercy. So on one end, I'm asking for wisdom to get it exactly right. And then at the other end, at the end of the day, I guess you could say, I'm saying, Lord, I've done the best I can. Now please have mercy. And so that would be the eighth foundational principle, is to ask God for mercy.
So, as I mentioned in the introduction, my husband in his radio broadcast mentioned 20 things that he was glad he did as a father when our kids were little. And I thought they were so phenomenal and thought they'd be a help for, and I realized, that the vast majority of watchers of this YouTube channel are women, and so I think in an effort to help us in our child rearing and in an effort to have strong families, it might be a help to hear these things. So I hope these are a blessing to you and to your families.
All right. These are not exhaustive. Volumes can be written about child rearing. And so this is not the end-all list, but they are exactly what Amy just called them, things I'm glad I did. And they may inspire you, or they may give birth to other ideas in your mind, but hopefully they'll get you thinking. And I'm thinking mostly as I talk about parents who are expecting children, or their children are very small, and there is not a lot of Bible-centered material out there. There just isn't. And so I hope that this will help you and make you think. First, I'm glad that on the day that each of them was born, that I told them about Jesus. First of all, my prayer every day for my children when they were small was, Lord, I pray that from the moment they are convicted of their sin, let there be no time pass between that moment and the day they turn to Christ for salvation. And so, but then that raises the question when your children are small. I think every Christian parent, our sort of nightmare is, what if my kids don't grow up and get saved? And so that leads to this question, well, when's the first time they should hear the gospel? And to me, the clear answer is the day they're born. Now, the truth is, they heard the gospel before they were born. They were going to church for 9 months before they were born. But the day they were born, I explained to each one of them how to be saved. And didn't do it every day of their life, but regularly made sure they heard a gospel presentation. And praise the Lord, each of them came to the point where they asked either Amy or myself, I want to be saved. Could you walk me through that? So I'm glad that I did that. I'm glad that I immediately began to teach our kids the meaning of the word obey. Now, here's a tricky thing about teaching. You're tempted to think, well, I can't teach them anything until they learn how to talk. All right, well, every human being understands facial expressions. Every human being understands tone of voice. And every human being understands happiness and sadness. So until they understand words, we have to use the things that they do understand to teach them concepts. And the first concept I wanted them to learn, well, it's not fair to say first, but one of the first concepts I wanted them to learn is the meaning of the word obey. When they were small, they heard obey constantly. And I remember, and my wife does too, the first time that Catherine was 6 months old. It was her first Christmas, and she had gotten, one of those swings where you wind it up and it just tick-tock back and forth. And she was in her swing on Christmas Day. And she reached out her hand to grab the support, which could very easily snap her arm and break her arm. And so I knew I had to teach her to keep her arms inside the thing. And so I put her hand back in the thing as it was swinging, back in the basket where she was sitting, and I said no. And she swung some more. She put her hand back out there, and I said no, and put her hand back in. And then she did it a third time, and I just very lightly, but hard enough that I knew it would upset her, I just tapped her hand, and she began to cry a little bit. And as I hit her hand and put it back in, I said, obey. And that's not a fond memory for me, because you don't like to hear your children cry. But the light tapping of her hand is better than her breaking her arm. And that's what we have to understand about discipline. None of us ever wants to make our children sad. But if they don't learn to obey, there's a whole lot more pain awaiting them in their lives. So they have to learn. And so from that moment, she began to learn what it means to obey. Children, when they're 3, 4, 5 years old, 6 years old, they don't respond to lectures and explanations. Let me tell you why I want you to do this or that. Obey should be enough, but they've got to learn what the word means. And I remember hearing a story of a man who lived out in the hills and in the mountains, and there were a lot of predators out there. And one day his son was walking down the hill away from the house, and the father saw some wild animal. I forget what it was, but a wild animal that was a threat to the boy's life. The father It was in a culture where hunting was common. He already had his rifle near him, but he needed his son to get out of the way. And whatever the predator was, I believe it was either a bear or a wolf, he yelled out to his son, "Son, get down." And because the son knew the meaning of the word obedience, he got down immediately on his face. He knew what that meant. And the man was able to shoot the wolf or the bear, whatever it was, to save the son's life. And the point is, if the son didn't know how to obey, then his son's life very well could have been in jeopardy. We lived, for most of our children's young years, we lived on a very busy road. And our house was the front door was just a couple hundred feet from this busy road. And I knew we had to have a limit where the kids couldn't go any further. And I knew that if they didn't know how to obey, they could very easily go out into that road. And so when they heard me say stop, they needed to stop. And if they didn't respond to stop, their life could be at jeopardy. We're so foolish that we don't believe in discipline, that we risk our children's safety.
Right.
And so I taught them all, and I'm glad I did, the meaning of the word obey. I'm also glad that I taught them to tell the truth. We did not tolerate lying. And a couple things we didn't tolerate. We didn't tolerate disrespect. I'm going to get to that in a minute. We didn't tolerate them saying no. We didn't think it was funny for them to say no. I know we watch videos like that, Listen Linda video. Oh, that's so funny, but we sure didn't tolerate anything like that.
No.
We didn't tolerate our children saying no. And, but we didn't tolerate them lying to us, and they knew it. And you have to think things through. Disobedience was, okay, there's a difference between doing something you probably shouldn't do and straight up disobeying. So we had to make those lines clear. And we also had to make the lines clear of, if you do something you're probably not supposed to do, but you tell the truth about it, it's going to turn out better.
Yes.
And you have to make it turn out better.
Right.
Than if you make up a lie. And we taught our children, we helped them understand, we can tell when you're lying. And didn't accuse them of lying, but you can talk with a 5-year-old and get them to confess when you know they're lying. So I didn't straight up say, "You're lying," because he had to tell or something, or she had to tell. But once I realized, oh, they're lying to me, I didn't accuse them of it. I just walked them through until they inevitably would have to confess. And not because I'm trying to find them guilty of something, but because I'm trying to train them. I'm trying to train them. And so we didn't tolerate lying.
And I think what that did when they were older kids too is help them to understand that they could bring anything home, and they could tell us exactly what happened or what the problem was, and we weren't going to freak out, and we weren't going to remind them of it all the time and throw it in their face, but they would, because we had a track record of embracing the truth no matter how hard it was, and rejecting cover-ups or lying, it helped when they were older to be able to say, "Mom or Dad, this went on," and they had the freedom to tell the truth because they knew, there are consequences, but we'll get through it together. Yeah,
if they came home from school or church and there had been some kind of a confrontation and they told us about it, we could say, "Okay, but did you do this?" And we knew the difference by that time between, well, yeah, to be honest, I did. Because they would, most of the time, say, "Yeah, I did." Or if they said, "I promise, I did not do that," we could tell.
We knew we could believe it.
Yeah. I'm also glad I taught my children to be respectful My father raised me, and I remember many times walking down the road or riding down the road, and a police officer passed. He would wave to the police officer, and I didn't understand that when I was a kid. Why? Just as a sign of respect. Respect police officers, respect authority, and so I pass that on to my children. I'm glad they are respectful, and they respect authority. And we did raise our children to say yes and yes sir, and no sir. Say it respectfully. And I know to some people they think that's military. It's not military. It's just respect, and it makes them good. By the way, it helps them get jobs.
Right.
It helps them get promoted in their jobs, and it's just a good thing all the way around. Glad we taught our children to be respectful. And then I'm glad that I worked to make my children feel secure. I'm glad that we worked to make our children feel secure. We did that from the moment they were born, tried to. Okay, so there's a philosophy that you let a baby in their crib start crying, and the philosophy says if you just let them cry it out. And so we talked about that very heavily. And we said, okay, again, we're training. Don't forget, everything you do is training them. If I let them cry it out, somewhere in their mind, they know that the source of my security is in the next room. And I am letting them know I am in discomfort, and they are ignoring me. And they gradually do not find their security in me or in their mom. So we made a conscious decision that, and listen, some of these things were not proven, and we hadn't heard people say anything about these things, but we just decided that we were not going to spoil our kids in the sense of, okay, we're going to make everything right for you, and we're going to try to change the whole world to adapt to you. We weren't going to do that. But we were never going to let our kids cry it out, right, especially alone, when they were little. We were going to go to them, pick them up, hold them for as long as they needed to be held. And I'm mostly talking about before they can walk, before they can crawl. They are on their own, and they need to know that they are secure. Mm-hmm. But even as they get older, it's still a principle. You just change how you adopt it. But listen, I've watched kids in shopping center parking lots, inside stores, inside restaurants, where the kid is crying and screaming, and the parent is just there shouting at them, screaming at them.
Right.
And I don't know what they're trying. Maybe they're trying to teach their child that tough it out. I don't know what they're trying to teach them, but they're not teaching what they're trying to teach.
Right.
What they're teaching them is, I am not where you find your security.
Right.
I am not where you find your strength. And I just didn't want our kids to learn that from me. I want them to learn that I'm here for you and I got you. And you know what? You know why? Because that's what God does for me.
Absolutely. Yeah.
God says, I got you, and you're going to be okay. And so I'm glad I did that.
Before we had children, I did not consider myself to be ready for motherhood. I felt very inept and very inadequate, but I did search the scriptures. How does God parent? And that's one of the things that kept jumping out at both of us. God never says, you know what, you need to learn to sleep through the night on your own and just deal with this, and yet we'll put a 7-day-old baby and expect them to just know how to do that and eventually wear themselves out. And if we're going to teach our children the love of God and the identification and security that they can find in Him, we have to parent like God does. And God rushes to our side when we need Him, when we're feeling vulnerable.
And that's, the training is such hard work. If you got to be there for that baby 24/7. And that means no more parties for a while. Not that we were party animals or anything, but
we were night owls.
That means no me time. for a lot of
Yeah.
time.
Yep.
And so if you're going to farm your kids out at just because you need that me time, training is not going to be as successful as you want it to be.
Yeah.